So, my name's Mary Ann, and I'm the executive director here. And I'm really happy to have Dottie Jean on our stage tonight. She was born and raised in Salisbury, North Carolina. She lived in Tryon from 1993 to 1999 when she moved to California. She moved back to Tryon when she retired in 2011, and that's when she began to pursue storytelling. She produced her first one woman show in 2012 and since then has produced three others. Tonight, she will be performing that first show, Hold Still, I Can't See Myself. Join me in welcoming Dottie Jean Kirk.
Thank you. You know, I was 65 years old before I knew what color my eyes were. All my life, I thought I had brown eyes. In fact, on every form I had to fill out, I wrote I had brown eyes. And if you looked at my driver's license today, it would say brown eyes. Well, when I was 65, that was about 12 years ago, I was talking to a friend, and I mentioned something about my brown eyes. And she said, "Brown eyes? You don't have brown eyes." I said, "I don't?" She said, "No, no, you have green eyes." Well, I jumped up right then and there and rushed to the bathroom to look in the mirror. And you know, by God, she was right. My eyes aren't brown. I would call them more hazel, but they're clearly not brown. The reason I thought I had brown eyes is that my mother had brown eyes, and she always said to me, "Oh, Dottie Jean, you have brown eyes just like me." In fact, I got my one-on-one time with my mother when she was putting on her makeup early in the day. And I would watch her in the mirror as she applied lotions, potions, tints, colors. And it took her, at least 40 minutes to do all that. And we stood there talking. That was my opportunity to ask her questions, learn about the world, try to understand things. That's how I learned what I looked like. She would say things like, "Dottie Jean, you have beautiful brown eyes, just like me." And then she said, "Oh, but you got baby fine hair just like your daddy. Or you've got good cheekbones like I do." So I formed my view of what I look like from my mother. And that's why I believed I had brown eyes. This incident with my friend reminded me of something my brother told me when I was in high school. We were both in high school. I said to him, I said, "I wish I were good at creative things like you are, but I'm just not." He said, "Oh, Dottie, you don't know what you're good at and what you're not good at. All you know is what other people tell you. We use other people as our mirrors." I thought, well, he was crazy. He was younger than me. Where did he get that information? And I thought, he's telling me I use other people to tell me who I am? Well, I didn't believe him. But over the course of my life, I realized he was right. We form our identity in large part based on other people, especially when we're young, because we don't know how to make those kinds of judgments. So all my life, I've used other people as mirrors. First my parents, then my teachers, other people. And when one mirror told me all it could tell me, I would look for another mirror. All my life, I've been chasing mirrors. My first mirrors were, of course, my mother and father. And as I said, my mother spent a lot of time with me one-on-one while she was looking in the mirror, putting on makeup. Interestingly, though, she didn't talk to me. She talked to the girl in the mirror, and I didn't talk to my mother. I talked to her mirror image. So that's how we communicated. My mother was a mirror for my looks and my social behavior. She would say things like to me like, "Oh, Dottie Jean, you're a polite, quiet little girl, just like I was when I was your age." And I knew that was a good thing. Or she would say, "Dottie Jean, you frown too much. You need to smile more. People think you don't like them. Watch me and do more of what I do. Smile." And I always have had that problem, so I've always thought of myself as having a scowling face and being quiet. In fact, I often tell people I have what they call resting bitch face. You know, people will say, "What's wrong?" when absolutely nothing is wrong. It's just the expression I have on my face. Daddy was a mirror too, of course. He didn't care anything about my personal appearance. He thought I looked fine, and that was enough. In fact, something I realized just recently, very rare, my father never once criticized me about anything. Not about anything I wore, about anything. But what he did care about was my mind, my brain. That was Daddy's big concern. And I knew that. I knew that Daddy valued the brain, and he wanted me to be smart, to learn quickly, and to have a fine intelligence, just like him. In fact, I can remember as a little girl, very young girl, kid, my mother would cook fish for dinner, and I didn't like it. And Daddy would say, "Eat your fish, Dottie Jean. It's brain food." And in fact, Mama liked to say that the first thing Daddy bought when I was born was a set of Encyclopedia Britannica. They're the gold standard when it comes to encyclopedias because all the articles in there were written by the originators, the original research people, historians and everything. They weren't digested and regurgitated stuff that you get in the encyclopedias generally. But I wanted so much to use them to please Daddy. But when I was beginning to school, I couldn't use them. They were way over my head. In addition, just to get them off of the shelf, the top shelf was an ordeal. They were large and heavy, but I loved them. I loved to look at them. I loved the feel of, they had very thin pages, and I loved the feel of them. And they had a slightly pebbled cover, so I enjoyed them, but I couldn't make anything out of the articles in them. I think I was well into high school before I could really use those as a resource for my homework and stuff. And Daddy didn't do with me the things that other fathers did with their children. He never played ball with us. I don't think I ever saw my father pitch a ball of any kind. He didn't teach us how to ride a bicycle, never taught me how to skate. In fact, I can remember only 2 times that he took us to the movies. Once before I started to school, we went to the drive-in to see some Disney thing. I can't remember what. And then when I was about 12, he took the family to see Mr. Roberts. That was a movie with Henry Fonda back in 1955, I think, if you don't know the reference. And not because he wanted to see Mr. Roberts, and certainly not because he cared anything about Henry Fonda, but it was a sweltering summer night. The power in our neighborhood had gone off, and the movie theater was air-conditioned. And that was the very last time my father ever went to a movie. In fact, it became kind of a family joke. Sometime we would go, my brother and I would go to a movie, my mother and I, friends and I, and we'd come back and talk about the movie. Daddy would say, I bet it wasn't as good as Mr. Roberts. So that just became a standing joke in the family, that movie. Some things I remember that really made a difference in my life, he helped me learn my multiplication table when I was in the 3rd grade. Every night he would drill me, 3 times 7, 8 times 6, on and on and on, until I knew them all perfectly. And I tried very hard because I knew that was important to Daddy, to learn those multiplication tables. The other thing he did is when I was in the 6th grade, every Tuesday there was a puzzle in the paper, the Salisbury Post. It was a word puzzle, and there were multiple sentences, about 25 sentences, and you had a word choice to complete that sentence or that would mean that sentence, but it wasn't a simple word choice. There were several things that could fit that. So for example, the sentence might be, this person is certainly biased. And then it had blank, E-A-L-O-U-S. So you could say jealous, or you could say zealous. So they were those kind of things. Another one was doing the love dance. And it could be blank, A-T-I-N-G, which we could complete with an M for mating or a D for dating. So this puzzle came out in the paper every Tuesday. And we sat down after dinner at the kitchen table, and Daddy and I worked through that puzzle. And we would talk about every sentence and about what the possible words choices could be. And he would explain his reasoning, and if I disagreed, I could explain mine, and then we'd decide which choice we wanted to make. We had a dictionary there. We would look words up. We'd talk about it. It took us a couple of hours to do that puzzle. The next day, Daddy would mail it in to the Salisbury Post, and the results would come out on Friday or sometime that week, and I'd rush for the paper to see if we'd won. Well, one week we did win, and I looked in the paper, and it had winners Raymond Kirk, that was my father, and Dottie Jean Kirk. I was so thrilled that he had included my name. So I cut that out of the paper, and the next morning walked to school. I would say I strutted to school that day because I couldn't wait to show it to my 6th grade teacher, Mrs. Thorne. I felt like she would make a lot over it, and my classmates would be impressed, and, it would be something good for me. So I took it, got to school a little early, went up to Mrs. Thorne's desk, and I handed her the article that showed that we had won the puzzle. She read it, and she said out loud so everybody in the class could hear it, she said, "Dottie Jean, I know you didn't work that puzzle. You're not smart enough. I know your daddy did that puzzle." I was so dejected. I just sort of slumped back to my desk, crestfallen. But I talked to Daddy about it that night, and he just shook his head. Didn't really say anything or get involved in it too much. But he does figure into another story about Mrs. Thorne. We had to have the weekly reader. Do y'all remember the weekly reader? And we would read articles in it, and we'd have to answer questions. So I had homework. And one of the articles was on Japan, and there were questions. One of the questions was, who's the Prime Minister of Japan? Well, I wrote down the answer that was in the weekly reader. And for some reason, I mentioned my homework to Daddy, and I mentioned that particular, I don't know why, whether he looked at it or what. He said, well, your answer's wrong. He said, they just got a new prime minister this week. I read it in the paper. And he made me change my answer to what he said was the correct answer. So the next day, I got to school, and interestingly, Mrs. Thorne called on me for that. I might have been looking particularly confident. I might have even raised my hand. I can't remember. But anyway, she asked the question, and I said, Hishiro Hatameo, or whatever the person's name was. She said, Dottie, what is wrong with you? All you had to do was copy that from the weekly reader. You couldn't even do that. Oh. I just could not keep from crying practically. I went back to my seat the whole day. I slunk down in my chair. It was just terrible. I got home and I told Daddy about it. As soon as I got home, I called Daddy. I said, Daddy, she said the answer was wrong. You gave me the wrong answer. Well, that night, Daddy got home. He had a newspaper under his arm, and he had the article showing who the Prime Minister was, and he was right. So the next morning, I go off to school bright and early, hoping to get there. So confident that Mrs. Thorne would make a big deal of it. And so, I was wrong. Dottie was right. I apologize. So I took the article into her to read. It was right before class started. She read it. She pursed her lips, folded it up, put it in her desk, and did not mention it. When I got home, I told Daddy, and he said, just let it go. We both know it doesn't matter. Just let it go. Finally, the day came when I was going to get out of the 6th grade, and I was so thrilled for many reasons. And I got my report card, and I was rushing home to show Daddy my report card, not because of the grades. They weren't outstanding, but because what she had written in the comments section. She had said, I admire Dottie's efforts to keep up with current events. So, we laughed about that. It became one of those jokes, kind of like Mr. Roberts. Whenever I would be good at something, Daddy would say, Dottie Jean, I admire your efforts to be good at chemistry. And I would say, Daddy, I admire your efforts to try to teach me to think. So Daddy was just probably the most important mirror in my life up until at the time I graduated from high school. And he I moved to Atlanta, I got out on my own, and I remember I was living in Atlanta, and it was Memorial Day weekend of 1985. And I got a call from home from my uncle, and he called me to say that Daddy had died, that he had had a massive heart attack that morning while he was fixing his breakfast. In fact, he was scrambling eggs, and that they knew he had died before he hit the floor because he had a bloodless wound on his forehead, so they had known that. So I went home right away, of course. My father was only 69 years old. He'd only been retired a few years. But when I got home, there's always family around. Mom and Daddy both had a lot of brothers and sisters. There's a lot of family and cousins and things. And my mother was just, I'd never seen my mother in such a frightened, sad, little girl kind of a way. She was just so upset. And it was hard to during the day with all those people to kind of help her and deal with her and so forth. But she was just not, she was crying, she was upset. But finally, after everybody left, I was able to spend some time with my mother. And finally got her into bed, and she kept saying over and over, "Why couldn't it have been me? Why couldn't it have been me? He could have made it on his own. I can't make it on my own." And at that point in my mother's life, this was 1985, she was 4 years younger than Daddy, so she had never written a check, never paid a bill, and she didn't know if she was rich or poor, and everything about life scared her. She was scared of having to do all those things that Daddy had always done. I tried to reassure her and try to help her, but it was very, very difficult for her. You have to prepare for a funeral, and all those things seem to be absolutely trivial when you're dealing with the death of someone close to you. And Mama wasn't able to do any funeral planning or any of that. She was just in a state of shock. So I did all of that. So the next morning, one of the first things I had to do was really one of the most trivial, is that I had to pick out clothes for Daddy to wear. And Daddy had never been in my life that I knew him anybody who cared about clothes. He didn't have a lot of clothes, and when his clothes got too old or too dated, Mama would have to force him to go out and shop for clothes. And when he did, he would buy enough clothes to last 4 or 5 years, so he wouldn't have to shop again. He didn't like to go shopping. So I went and looked in his closet, and there wasn't a lot there, but I did find a dress shirt picked up from the laundry some years ago that was still wrapped around cardboard and wrapped in plastic. Found a tie, his best suit. I looked down on the closet floor and noticed Daddy's white bucks. They were his only nod to fashion. I don't know if you know what white bucks are, but they're white buckskin shoes with sort of a pink rubber sole. They were popular in the 30s and 40s and 50s. I have a pair, in fact. But he put them on every year after Memorial Day, and then he would wear them off and on during the summer until Labor Day. Well, I saw those on the floor, and I thought, well, maybe I should take those. The funeral would be after Memorial Day. But but the funeral director had said specifically not to bring shoes because they wouldn't be seen anyway. So I didn't take them with me. So I went to the funeral home that morning. I had an appointment with the funeral director, took Daddy's clothes and went in. And when I went into the funeral home, one of those men that works there, very quietly, gliding toward me as they do in their kind of unctuous way, he came up to me, and I said who I was, and he said, "Well, I have something for you." And he handed me an envelope. And I said, well, what is it? He said, I don't know, but a woman left it for you here early this morning, said to give this to Raymond's daughter. And I said, well, who was she? He said, I don't know. I wasn't on duty then. Somebody else was here. And I looked at the envelope, and it was a funeral home envelope, and had written on the outside, pictures of Raymond Kirk. So I had an appointment right away with the funeral director to plan the funeral, so I just stuck them in my handbag. And over the next few days, I didn't even think about him. I didn't even look at him. I didn't think about him. So when I finally got back to Atlanta and realized I had them, I took them out to look at them. And I was astonished at the pictures there. There were 41 small, about 2 inches by 2 inches, black and white photographs of my father. And this was a man I did not know. I had never seen my father look like this. He was exceptionally handsome. Now that I knew. I knew Daddy was exceptionally handsome because women were always telling me how handsome my father was. But this man was dressed like you'd see somebody in a fashion magazine. One picture in particular, he was standing beside a car, must have been 1930s something, and he had on a pinstripe double-breasted suit that was cut in at the middle. The pants broke at just the right point over his shoes, and they were spectators. And I love spectators. In fact, I've loved him all my life, and I didn't know it was a genetic thing. So there's a picture of him looking so handsome in that suit and the spectators. There's a picture of Daddy, lots of pictures of Daddy, but one of them, he's dressed up in pants of spectators on a motor scooter at the beach, of all things, at the beach. And then there's a picture of him sort of in a relaxed pose, sitting on a stone wall. He has his wrists crossed in a very appealing way, and he's got an open collar. He's got a straw hat on, sitting in kind of a jaunty way. And he looks like life is good to him at that moment. There was one where he appeared to be showing off a ring of some sort. I can't figure that one off. And all of his poses, and that's what they were poses. They weren't casual shots. He arranged his body in a pleasing way for the photographer, whom I did not know who the photographer was at that time. So he always his body made good lines. He was sitting, and it was none of this slouching, legs crossed, kind of sloppy, masculine way. It was very like a dancer. And so there are a whole series of these photographs. You know, if you've been to my last show that I talked about being a story sleuth, I've always been a story sleuth because I had not only to figure out who I was when I was a child, but I had to figure out all those stories that swirled around me. I only got pieces of those stories. So I only had pieces of the stories, but I could put together several things I knew for sure. I knew that whoever the photographer was, she was in love with my father. It was clear because the camera got him in the best possible pose. The camera was adoring him. My father was in love with whoever that was too, taking the pictures, because he was posing. He wanted to look attractive. And some of them he looked very happy. They were a couple taking trips together. There was no family reunions, no group parties, anything like that. And there were 41 pictures, and all but 4 of them, my father was the only subject. So they were going places, traveling, having time on their own, without family, without friends. There was a picture at the beach, a picture of them at Natural Bridge in Virginia, various places. The pictures with other people, in 3 of them, it was Daddy with one of his 5 sisters, and I recognized those. But in one picture, Daddy was standing between 2 women. The one I recognized that was on his left was my Aunt Dorothy. But the one on the other side of him, I didn't recognize at all. I had never seen her, and I'd never seen a picture of her. But my father's head was tilted kind of like in her direction, as though to give me a clue. Like, this is she. So I also noticed he had on his white bucks, and she had on a kind of casual spectator in saddle Oxfords. There's that black and white shoe kind of. But that's all I knew about him. I didn't show these pictures to my mother, and I didn't take them back because we'd never seen any of these at home, and I didn't know how she'd feel knowing there were pictures of Daddy with somebody else taking those pictures. He looked about 20, which would have been about 5 years before he met my mother. And so I never showed them to her, so I didn't have the opportunity to ask who they belonged to, who the woman was or anything. After my mother died, though, my Aunt Jean was visiting me. She's the family historian. She knew everything. I said, well, do you know who that woman is there standing next to Daddy? And she said, well, of course. That's Pinky. I said, Pinky. Pinky was Daddy's girlfriend before Mama. And Mama used to tease Daddy about Pinky. And, so I'd hear her name occasionally, but I had no idea what she looked like, and I had never met her. And the only conclusion I could come to is that Pinky had those pictures. She was a photographer. She had those pictures. She had saved those pictures for 50 years. That was 50 years, and she had taken them to the funeral home so that I could see a different side of my father. I could see that handsome, dashing, fashionable young man that I had never known. Now, when I look at those pictures, some of them are in your program, I realize he once liked clothes and was fashionable. Looking in his closet that day, I wouldn't have known it. As I was looking in his closet, though, I had to, after I picked out the clothes, I noticed his jacket there, and inside the jacket was his wallet. And I reached to pick it out because I thought there might be some things in there I might need, identification and so forth. But I felt like a little girl going in his jacket to get his wallet. I half expected to turn around and see Daddy looking at me and disrespecting his privacy, but I knew I had to do it. So I pulled out that wallet. It was very worn and old. Daddy didn't change wallets very often either. But so I opened it up, and I got his driver's license, Social Security, insurance cards. But I noticed there was only one picture in his wallet. And it was my baby picture from 1944. I was less than 1 year old, sitting in a high chair. They took that picture to send to my uncle, who was over in Italy during World War II. He wrote back and said, "My, she has big feet." Another mirror for me. But I was just astonished that Daddy had carried that picture, the only picture in his wallet, from wallet to wallet for 50 years. So I took out that picture to look at it. And as I took it out, something fell from behind the picture and fluttered to the floor. I reached down to pick it up. It was sort of a yellowed piece of paper. I picked it up and looked at it. It was a piece of notebook paper. And it was just had been torn off of the top of a piece of notebook paper. It had one side where you have the holes in the notebook. It had those reinforcement rings. Do y'all remember? People don't even probably remember notebook paper anymore. But it had those reinforcement rings. And then I recognized the handwriting. I said, gosh, that's my handwriting. And it said, "Dear Fairy, I had 3 teeth pulled. I left them on the bus. Dottie Jean." Well, I had remembered that day. Mama and I had gone to the dentist. I had to have 3 baby teeth pulled. And we rode the bus because Mama didn't yet drive. And the dentist had put all 3 teeth in a little box for me to take and put under my pillow that night. Riding home on the bus, I was in pain. I didn't feel good. It was awful. And I left those teeth on the bus. Somebody must have found them. I don't know. But when I got home, that was just kind of the straw for me that day. I started crying. "Oh, Mama, I left my teeth on the bus. The tooth fairy's not going to come tonight. I want everything." She said, "Well, why don't you just write the tooth fairy a note?" And I thought that seemed reasonable. So I did. I wrote the tooth fairy a note, and I put that note instead of the teeth under my pillow. The next morning, as soon as I woke up, my eyes opened, I looked under the pillow. The note was gone. And in its place were 3 shiny quarters. So the tooth fairy had taken the note, and in its place had left me 3 quarters. And he put that note in his wallet behind my baby picture. So, getting through all that with Mama was really difficult. I stayed with her as long as I could after the funeral, but she was just terrified. I want to give you, before I tell you the next story, I want to give you a little background on my mother. I haven't told as much about her as I did about my father, but my mother was a change of life baby, and she was born into a family of red-headed Irish people, but she had black hair. And she had deep brown eyes, chocolate brown eyes, not at all like my eyes. And she was outgoing. She loved people. She liked to party. She had a good time. But she was, until I graduated from high school, I grew up in a house in which there was no alcohol. She'd grown up a strict Southern Baptist. There was never any alcohol that I saw in the house. Nobody ever drank. My mother never drank. We never saw alcohol. Now, my brother and I, what parents don't know, my brother and I knew that house better than they did. We knew where everything was. We knew, for example, Daddy would come home from work, and he'd want to read the paper, sit down, read, relax, watch television. And every now and then, he'd get up and go to the bathroom. In the bathroom, there was a big closet. It was just a junk closet for stuff. Daddy had a tackle box there he had never used, an old fan, his coin collection, stuff like that, bathroom supplies. But Daddy's old army overcoat was in that closet, back sort of in the corner. It was big, heavy, and green. And in the pocket of that army overcoat was a brown paper bag. And in that brown paper bag was always a pint of bourbon. So Daddy would get up several times during the evening and go to the bathroom. And so I used to call that the bathroom bar. And we didn't say anything. We didn't blow his cover. I'm sure Mama knew, but she probably thought we never noticed and didn't know what was going on. So it was so important. But Mama always knew how to have a good time without alcohol. But when I was graduating from high school and getting ready to go to college, Mama had developed a certain restlessness. I think she knew she was about to be an empty nester. I'd be out, my brother would be out. She was feeling like maybe what is she going to do with her life? She bought a convertible of all things, and she started doing things that I thought were unusual for my mother. So one night, the summer after I graduated from high school, my best friend Dolores and I had gone to the movie. And when we came back, Dolores stopped in the house with me to see Mama. And we heard a lot of laughing and good times being had in the kitchen. And so it's not unusual. Mama liked to laugh, liked to have friends over, do things like that. So we walked into the kitchen, and I was just stunned to see that my mother and her friends were drinking beer. Out in the open. But even more shocking than that, they were eating pickled pig's feet. Something I had never seen in the house either. And after that time, Mama stopped being a teetotaler. But she was still sensitive about the alcohol, and she didn't want people from the church to know that she drank. In fact, a friend of mine, Charlene, came up from Atlanta one time to visit Mama in the summer, and Mama's friend Jane was there, and Mama fixed us 4 drinks. I was drinking scotch and soda, Mama was having bourbon and something. We were about to take them out in the backyard and sit with them when the doorbell rang. And Mama looked at the front door and she said, "Oh my God, it's Hallie from the First Baptist Church. Give me those drinks." And she put them in the refrigerator. And then she went to answer the door and ushered Hallie back into the kitchen. And she introduced everybody. And when she got to me, she said, "Hallie, I'd like you to meet my daughter, Dolly." So after Mom and Daddy retired, I knew that they had been perhaps drinking too much. I had, in fact, sort of hinted at Mama that, maybe, because sometimes I would call her and I could tell. And she would say, "Well, no, I don't drink too much. I never drink. I can't be an alcoholic. I never drink before 5 o'clock. And that meant everything was okay with her. But after Daddy died, her drinking got a lot worse, mainly because she was so scared and afraid. And one day, the neighbors across the street called me, and they'd been our neighbors for as long as I had been alive. It was a stable neighborhood. They called me and said, "We're worried about your mama. She went to bed last night, and she left the doors open, all the lights on, and didn't lock up or anything." So I knew that Mama was kind of in deep trouble about the drinking, and I was worried and didn't know exactly how to handle that because it was a subject I just couldn't bring up with her without her getting very, very defensive. Well, things sometimes happen. You find what you need sometimes. So I went to my favorite bookstore in Atlanta, and I was browsing the self-help section, just looking for things that might help me. And I saw this little slender volume called "I'll Quit Tomorrow." And it was by, I think Vernon Johnson was his name. I picked it up, and I read almost the whole thing standing there. I bought it anyway, but standing there, I read it, and he said several things. He said, "Alcoholics know they're in trouble. They won't admit it. They'll try to create a crisis to get people to step in, and they won't help, but they're not going to ask for it. So you have to look for the signs." He also described something called an intervention, which, if you remember Betty Ford and the Ford family, they did an intervention when they talked to Betty Ford about how the alcohol affected them and everything. And that's the beginning of what ultimately ended up being the Betty Ford Center in the desert in California. So I bought the book, not knowing if I'd ever be able to use it or not. But my mother called me that very night, Of course, that wasn't unusual. We talked most of the days. And she said to me, "Dottie Jean," she said, "I'm losing my balance." She said, "I've started walking around the house holding onto the broom." She said, "I saw an ad on television about a hypnotist, and I think a hypnotist could help me." And I almost said, "Mama, don't be silly. You hypnotist? You don't need a hypnotist. You need to stop drinking." But I didn't say that. I said, "Well, that's interesting. I've always wanted to be hypnotized. That's an interesting idea. That'd be fine." I said, "But before you do that, do you think maybe we could look at your drinking and see if it might contribute a little bit to this?" And she said, "Yes, you're right." I couldn't believe it. I said, "I'll be there tomorrow." And I drove up there the next morning. I had called ahead. At that time, they had residential rehab programs for 4-week programs for people. I don't know if they don't have those anymore, I don't think. But I'd called them in advance. They were in Salisbury and made arrangements to go out there. And I went up there and confident I'd be able to get my mother into rehab. But when I got there, of course, her defenses were back. And she said, "Well, I know I got a problem, but now that I know I have a problem, I can take care of it." I said, "No, I don't think you can. I think you need to go and get some help and be with people who know what they're doing." And it took a long, long time, and she finally agreed, and mainly because I told her, I forgot to tell you what was really important here at the first of the thing. When I was so worried about my mother, I had a dream about my father. I actually feel like my father appeared in the dream to me. It was that vivid a dream. The dream started, and I thought, "I got to find Daddy. He'll know what to do. He'll be able to tell me what to do." And so in the dream, I set out, not knowing where I was going, but confident that I would find my father. And in fact, I saw a light that was like a beacon, and I followed it. I thought, "That's where Daddy is. That's where Daddy is." And as I got closer, I saw that beacon was my father's face. And I walked up to him. He was standing on the veranda of some big heavenly mansion, no doubt. But I walked up to him and said, "Oh, Daddy, I'm so glad to see you." He said, "Dottie Jean, He said, your mother is in grave danger. I said, I know. It has to do with leaving the doors unlocked and all that stuff. She said, no. He said, no. It has something to do with water. Well, water? And then that was the end of the dream. He disappeared. The next morning I woke up, that dream was very much on my mind. Water? How could it be water? So I called my brother. I said, this is my dream. What did Daddy mean it had something to do with water? He said, we know dreams are sometimes about opposites. Maybe it's about fire. Maybe Mama, she smoked, would go to sleep with a cigarette burning and the house catch on fire, and maybe that's the part of it. And we talked a little bit about it, and before I finally realized, no, it's about what she's drinking. It's not about water. It's about what she's drinking. So I had told her about that and told her that Daddy wanted to help her, and he had appeared to me in that dream, and that's what's decided her to go to the rehab center. Still, she wasn't completely convinced, so I arranged a little mini intervention and had a couple of my aunts came and talked to her. So we went out to the rehab center, and it was touch and go. She realized she was going to have to room with somebody. She didn't like that idea. But eventually I said, Mama, you can't turn around now. You've come so far. So she decided to stay. And they told me as I left the rehab center, they said, don't contact your mother for 48 hours. If she tries to contact you, don't answer the phone. She needs to get adjusted. So I didn't go home. I went to stay with my aunt and uncle. And I stayed there for, about 48 hours. And but one day, the second day, I think, that Mama was there, we went over to my house because I wanted to pour out all the liquor that was there. I didn't want her to come home and find any alcohol in the house. So my uncle went with me, and we found all the alcohol, and we poured it down the drain. My uncle was very nervous about this. He didn't want to do it. He said, Dottie Jean, we're going to catch hell. Your mother's going to come home, and she's going to wonder what happened to all her liquor, and we're going to have to go out and buy this again. This is foolish. She's not going to stay there. I don't want to disillusion you, but this... I said, no, we're going to do it. So we did it. We got rid of all of it. Then we headed back to his house. When we got back into his house, my aunt said, well, the rehab center said to call them out there. And Bill said, I knew it. I'm going to go turn the car around. I'll be ready. We'll go out there. I'm sure your mother wants to come home. And I thought, well, he's probably right. So we went out. So I called, and the woman said, your mother's in class right now, but she left a message for you. She said to go to the Krispy Kreme store and buy 3 dozen donuts and bring them out there for her and her friends. So I did. We went and I got 3 dozen donuts. But when I got to the rehab center, she was still in class or too busy to see me, so I had to leave him at the desk. My mother was having a great time. One, she wasn't alone. There were people there. There was a woman there that she knew that had been a nurse in the hospital when I was born. There were a lot of young people that had addiction problems, and they made over her and treated her like she was the queen of rehab. And, and she ate it up. She just loved it. And she stayed the whole 4 weeks. And at the end, I went to her graduation ceremony. They had a little event for her graduation. And after that, she came home. She never had another drink, and she never asked me where her liquor was. One last thing she did for me is she wrote me a letter. And my mother only got through the 7th grade, but she knew how to write sentences, and she knew how to pull on your emotions with her writing. She always said, I'll write a novel, but I just can't spell. I said, Mama, I'll take care of the spelling. Just write the novel. She was a storyteller, too, by the way, and I tell some of her stories. Well, this is her letter to me after she came home. She said, to my daughter, her name is Dottie. She got it right. You are a lucky girl. Like me, you had a wonderful man for a father. You always thought you belonged to me, but you didn't. From the day you were born, you put a ring in his nose. From the day he named you Dorothy Jean Kirk, your father couldn't put into words how he felt. The one thing I want you to remember about him is the light you put in his eyes when you would walk in the room, come home from school, come to the office to see him, call him from college, and tell him to put on his track shoes and go to the bank and put some money in for you? I was an English teacher at one time. Notice that parallelism there? That's really good. Your father, not me, made the sacrifice for you to have the college education and the good things that made life easy for you. Mama. So I finally had a really full picture of my father and the influence he had been on my life, and probably the most influential mirror I had in my life. I've had other mirrors. I've had some teachers that were mirrors. Mrs. Thorne was one of them. That was my 6th grade teacher. But one of them was the music teacher for our all the elementary schools in Salisbury. There were 4 elementary schools, and she traveled from elementary school to elementary school. When I say teaching music, it was mainly singing. And she was an older woman. She was so unpleasant. There was not one likable thing about her. And we had to sing these songs all the time in class. She carried a pitch pipe and would, try to get us to sing. And she was tall and skinny. She had kind of stringy hair, and I'm going to say something politically incorrect, but we sort of thought she was an old maid. And but I didn't like her. Not many people liked her. But we were getting ready with the 4th grade. We had 2 4th grade classes in our elementary school to do a special PTA meeting where we would do a program for our parents. All the classes would do something. The younger classes did acrobatics and tumbling, and some of the older classes did square dancing or something. But our 4th grade class was going to sing, the two classes. And so we had to go to the auditorium of our elementary school, Wiley School, and rehearse that day, because we were going to sing that night. We were going to sing one of my favorite songs. It's a lullaby, Now the Day Is Over. It's such a comforting song for children. Has a secure feeling, comforting. It's sweet, has a wonderful sound. Much better than that other lullaby in which a baby falls out of a tree. But it was one of my favorite songs. And I love to sing it. I liked to sing when I was a child, and I enjoyed it. So, now the day is over, night is drawing nigh, shadows of the evening steal across the sky. Now the darkness gathers, stars begin to peep, birds and bees and flowers soon will be asleep. I love that song. You'll know in a little bit what a journey it's been to get to this point. But we were rehearsing, and Miss Gamble, we were arranged in a semicircle like a choir, I guess, and she decided she heard some things that weren't quite pleasing to her. So she decided she would go around the semicircle and listen to what everybody was singing. So she would go to each student and she would lean down, put her ear to their mouth, and then stand up and move to the next person. So when she got to me, I was already a little nervous. And she leaned down, and her hair got in my face. And I was uncomfortable, and I didn't like it. And she listened to me sing, put her ear to my mouth, and she listened to me sing, and she stood up, and she said, "Honey, don't you sing. You just move your lips." Well, I felt intense heat rise up from that auditorium floor. so hot. It got to my face. My face was flushed. It felt like insects circling around my face. I was kind of paralyzed in place. I would have run away if I could. But I know now what I felt was shame. I was so ashamed. I knew that everybody then knew that something was wrong with me. I was flawed in some serious way. Something was wrong with my voice, and I didn't know what it was. I'd always thought I had a good voice. In fact, my mother told me I did. Just like she told me I had brown eyes. One day, when it was around Christmas, my grandmother came over, and one of my grandmother's daughters was the go-to singer in town. She'd been to college and majored in vocal performance, and every small town has that person that sings at all the funerals and all the weddings, and she was a choir director. And Mama wanted me to sing something for my grandmother. So she said, Dottie Jean, sing something for your grandmother. So I broke into an operatic version of Joy to the World. And Mama said, see, she's just like her Aunt Jean. She's got that voice. So I thought, wow, I got a great voice. Until Miss Gamble told me just to move my lips. Well, I went home that day. I was just so dejected. Do you think I told Mom and Daddy about it? No, didn't tell them. I didn't tell anybody. I was too embarrassed. I didn't want Mom and Daddy to know that their daughter wasn't perfect. So I got there that night, and I did exactly as I was told. I just moved my lips. And I stopped singing that day. I never sang again. In fact, at church, because we went to church a lot, always liked the hymns, couldn't sing, had to move my lips. At the school assemblies, I couldn't sing, I had to move my lips. Birthday parties for friends, even there when it really didn't matter, I moved my lips because I was so afraid of what my voice would offend them in some way. In fact, I became the world's most proficient mute singer. And nobody really knew that I was not singing. Miss Gamble, the teacher, never ever seen. She thought I had either learned that lesson well about just moving my lips or had somehow gotten a lot better. But she never said, and she never came back to me and said, Dottie Jean, let me explain to you, let me work with you on tone or whatever. Never, ever said a word. So I had no idea what was wrong with my voice. I got an inkling of what that might be when I was a freshman in high school. My English teacher brought in a tape recorder. I'd never heard my taped voice. This was 1957. We didn't have telephone messaging machines. We didn't have iPhones with voice recorders. We didn't have any of that. In fact, he brought in a tape recorder, but it was in a big suitcase, and it had reels on it. So he had us each read a stanza of a poem, and then he would play it back. So he did that, and he got to me. I read I don't remember the poem, but I read a stanza, and then he played it back. And everybody laughed. Guffaw kind of a laugh. Laughed out loud in an ugly sort of way. And I myself was astonished because I thought, is that me? Is that brusque, low voice me? And I thought, so that's it. I sound like a boy. I thought, that's what's wrong with my voice. I've got a low voice. And that impression stayed with me for a long time because if I talk on the phone to make reservations of some sort or do anything, they would say, yes, sir, thank you, sir. Sometimes in a retail line, if they didn't look closely, they would say, thank you, sir. I would get so angry. They didn't know sometimes how angry I got. So I thought, that's just it. I've just got a very low voice, and I still didn't sing. But when I was living in California, I had a friend I met there, and she was a singer. And she had just gotten back to singing after her husband had died. He was a lot older than she was, and she wanted to get back to singing. And she was taking lessons from a teacher in town, Janet Hopkins, who had been with the Metropolitan Opera for 16 years and was living in the desert at that time. She said, oh, Dorothy, everybody can sing. You should take lessons from Janet. You'd be able to sing. I thought, there's no way I'm doing that. Janet would probably be like Miss Gamble on steroids. So I was polite, but I didn't. But I was working in Galveston, traveling in my job back and forth every week, and Hurricane Ike came through Galveston and really had devastating results. So I was out of work for a few months, and I got bored. And I thought, well, what have I got to lose? I'm close to retirement. What have I got to lose by taking singing lessons? So I called Janet, and I arranged for singing lessons. But I was terrified. I was so terrified. In fact, I stood outside of her door a long time before. In fact, I don't think I knocked. I think she came to the door and opened it for me. And I went in there, and I was terrified. I really couldn't even make a sound. But I was pretty certain it would all be short-lived because I thought she will say, well, you could sing bass in the choir, but you don't want to do that. There's nothing much I can do for you. But she didn't. It was almost as though I'd come in with a clarinet, and she was to teach me to play. She was very objective about it. She told me things to do, gave me exercises. It was just like learning anything, really. So after several months, I got over my fear. Not over did I get over my fear, but I had great joy. I loved those singing lessons. It was the removal of a huge burden from my life, but the other is just a joy. I left so energetic, feeling younger, lighter. I mentioned that to Janet. She said, "Oh, that's just the effects of oxygenation." So I wasn't really getting younger or lighter, I guess. But one day we were doing the scales, and we kept going up the scales and up the scales and up the scales. And I stopped. I said, "Janet," I said, "you know what?" She said, "What?" She said, "I can sing these high notes." She said, "Yes, you can. That's because you're a soprano." Well, my cosmic egg cracked that day. I said, "A soprano? How can I be a soprano? People say 'sir' to me. I have a low voice." She said, "Oh, your speaking voice has nothing to do with your singing voice." She said, "I've known women with low voices who were very high soprano. I've known men that had higher voices but sang the deepest bass. It's two different systems. They're not the same." So I thought, wow, if I all my life thought I had brown eyes and I didn't have brown eyes, and I thought I had an ugly, awful bass voice maybe, and I don't, I could be a soprano. What do I really know about myself? Could I be an actress and not an analyst, because I'd always had an analytical career? Could I be complete creative? Could I be a completely different person? I don't know who I am. I really felt like my identity was up for grabs that day. And so I continued singing lessons with her, and at night I would have such energy from that oxygen that I would get up. I couldn't sleep. I'd get up, and I started writing stories. And I started writing some of the stories I tell tonight, and I tell. They were stories I had told informally to friends, but I started writing them, and I knew that what I wanted to do with them was to weave them into some sort of a performance. But I didn't know exactly how to do that. But in fact, a friend asked me, she said, "Does your teacher see any potential in you as a singer?" I said, "I don't want to be a singer. I want to be a storyteller." And there's something about the singing that enabled the storytelling. It gave me my voice. My favorite quote is one that is, "To have a voice is to have a self. And to have a self is powerful." And that is true. I hate to use that cliche, finding my voice, but getting my voice back, realizing there was nothing wrong with my voice, gave me a sense of personal power and capability that I had not had to that point. So after that, I did continue. I got a storytelling coach to help me weave those into some kind of a show, the first show that I did here today. So, and since I have come back, I retired, moved from the desert. Janet moved. She's teaching at the University of South Carolina in Columbia now. But, sometimes things happen the way they're supposed to happen. And as God would have it, I bought a house here in Tryon, next door to an well-renowned opera singer and singing teacher, Sonia Carlson. Yes. who is my singing teacher and has helped me. In fact, she encouraged me to do this show again here tonight. So that was the whole. It's been an amazing kind of journey. My last mirror and the last story I have, I think I'm doing good. Uh, I left the 6th grade and left Mrs. Thorne behind, but I thought it's going to be great. I'd entered the 7th grade. We started changing classes, growing up, all those wonderful things. But then I learned that my teacher, for the next 2 years, in fact, for several subjects, was going to be Miss Helen Jenkins. Miss Helen Jenkins was the toughest, strictest teacher at Wiley School. Everyone was terrified of her. In fact, they called her Little Hell. She was about 5 feet tall, and so there's nothing little about her except her height. She had the presence of a 7-footer. And everybody that had had her as a teacher before would warn the younger students, watch out for Little Hell. She'll make your life hell. And I was sure she would. I was sure she would, just as Mrs. Thorne had done. She would torment me, belittle me, all those things, and I just dreaded it. That first day walking to her class, I was so, I don't want to do this. And there she was, standing outside of her door. She always stood guard outside of her door. We had 10 minutes between classes to go to the bathroom, do things. Most teachers rushed to the teacher's lounge to take a smoke or sit down for a few minutes, but not her. She stood there like a soldier at her door to make sure we didn't escape. And but I can't tell you, some magical transformation happened. I started loving her class. She taught me English, she taught science, she taught history, she taught the girls PE and physical education. But the English was what she was known for. And she was so strict. She would give a D for a run-on sentence, a D for a sentence fragment. It didn't take much to flunk in her class. But we learned it. And a lot of people didn't like her. But people, after they got out of high school and college, they loved her. They learned all the English grammar they needed to know, and they said so. She's the favorite teacher of a lot of people that had her. In fact, I think more passwords have as a password hint her name is favorite teacher than probably anybody else. But she made it seem like learning English and learning how to speak well and write well was the key to adulthood. And if we wanted anything in the 7th and 8th grade, we wanted to be adults. So I tried really hard because I thought, this is my out of here card. So I learned, and I can remember my thrill the first time the phone rang, and I picked it up, and somebody said, "Can I speak to Dottie?" And I said, "This is she." I didn't say it's me or this is her. I thought, oh, wow, this is wonderful. So I loved everything about her class, or all of her classes. In fact, for health, she taught us a lot of things that teachers shouldn't really have to teach, really. She taught the importance of using deodorant, which some people at that age didn't know. And she taught girls, she said, it is so easy to make boys like you. And we just were eager to find out. She said, all you have to do is make them think they're the smartest, handsomest, best thing you've ever laid eyes on. And she said, don't you ever let them know you're smarter than they are. And I thought, the lines of that Peggy Lee song, is that all there is? She also taught us physical education. We did calisthenics. She taught us we still do some of those exercises, or did, and we played basketball. But one spring day, it was beautiful, and she took us out to the softball field to play softball. And I was assigned the position, I don't even know what you call it, I'm not an athlete, between first and second base. And I was out there, it was a beautiful day, the sun was shining. I was daydreaming, as I do all the time, and enjoying the gentle breeze and the sun. And suddenly, a ground ball came my way and went right past me. And I missed it. Miss Jenkins yelled out, "Dottie, are you out there just to get your vitamin D, or do you want to play ball?" Oh, I was so upset with myself. I mean, I was mad because, I always wanted to make a good impression around Miss Jenkins. So I was still fuming when we came in for our turn at bat. And when I got up to bat, she could see I was still just all agitated and irritated and everything. And she said, just as I'm getting ready to go to bat, she said, "Dottie, pretend that ball is me." And I did. And I hit it, and it was a home run. And I went running around those bases, and as I crossed the home plate, I just noticed Miss Jenkins just shaking her head and smiling. Miss Jenkins, Daddy had the occasion to see Miss Jenkins in his work, and he knew that she was my favorite teacher. And he would come home and he would say, "I saw your favorite teacher today, and she said something awfully nice about you." He'd make me beg for it. I'd say, Daddy, what'd she say? What'd she say? He'd say, "Well, what's it worth to you? I think you ought to earn it." And I said, "Oh, I'll read a book every week. I'll wash your car. I'll clean your white buck shoes." And all promises I knew Daddy wouldn't make me live up to. And so he would tell me something, always something I liked to hear. She told him one time I was very good at science. I should consider science as a career, which I did. And all kinds of things. But he knew that I would walk across the burning sands of the Sahara barefoot to hear anything Miss Jenkins said about me. Miss Jenkins was the best kind of mirror. She wasn't a mirror that reflected back to me who I was. She was a mirror that reflected back to me who I could be. She was the only person that saw certain possibilities in me. In fact, I call her a mirror of possibility. One day she stopped me in the hall and she said, "Dottie, you got a good sense of humor and a real comedic sense. You're good at comedy." She said, "I think that you would be good at that, and I have suggested to Mr. Eisenberg, our principal, that he pull a few of you together and y'all put on a little skit for school assembly one day." I thought, wow. She said, "You'd be great at writing and performing in it." I thought, wow, she wants me to write and perform in the skit. She thinks I'm good at comedy. I was so thrilled, and I knew I had a good time with my friends, and we joked, and I didn't think of it as having a sense of comedy, just having a good time and sense of humor. So sure enough, a few days later, Mr. Eisenberg called us into his office and said he wanted us to go off and prepare a skit, come back in a week and tell him what it was and so forth. So we worked for a week and on this. And this was 56 maybe. And we were highly influenced by television. The comics on television at that time used a lot of physical humor. Jerry Lewis, Red Skelton, Milton Berle, all those people. So our skit had a lot of physical humor in it. It wasn't really verbally witty. So influenced by Betty Furness. Anybody remember Betty Furness? Okay. We had a skit in which we were advertising a refrigerator. And that has possibilities, right? And we were going to, everything we did with the refrigerator was going to be something goofy would go wrong. Open the door falls off the hinges. Take off a tray of ice and talk about how quick it freezes, but it's nothing but water. All those kinds of things. So we explained the skit to Mr. Eisenberg, who sat there stone-faced, never smiled, didn't say anything. Mr. Eisenberg was not a mirror possibility. He was a dark hole. So at the end of this, he said, "Well, we'll just never get a refrigerator on the stage of Wally School. I'm just afraid that's not going to work out." So we never got to do it. But Miss Jenkins had some other ideas in mind. A couple weeks later, she said, "We're going to have a talent show." She said, "It's just our class. We're going to go to the school auditorium, and we're going to each do something we're good at. You can tell jokes. You can bring a musical instrument to play. You can read a poem, recite a poem. Whatever it is you'd like to do, you could do." Well, I didn't have anything I could do. So she said it was totally voluntary, so I was just delighted at that. So we went to the auditorium that day, and I was going to sit it out and just enjoying it. People came up and did different things. I can't remember now what they did. But Miss Jenkins was loving it. She was laughing, having a good time. It was Friday afternoon. The teachers were always in a good mood on Friday afternoon. And I thought, gosh, I'm missing out on an opportunity to impress Miss Jenkins. So I thought, well, what can I do? What can I do? I didn't bring my French horn. I didn't have anything else I could do, no poem I could recite. We did learn a Boobin Adam, but I didn't want to recite that poem. But it finally occurred to me there was something I could do. So finally she said, any more volunteers? And I raised my hand rather courageously. And I said, she said, yes, okay, Dottie, get up and surprise me. So I did. I got up, looked out at my classmates, at Miss Jenkins, and I started singing. Well, now since my baby left me, I found a new place to dwell. It's down at the end of Lonely Street at Heartbreak Hotel. Well, I looked at Miss Jenkins to get her reaction. She was doubled over in laughter. She just encouraged me. Mrs. Thorne would have said, what do you think you're doing? Take your seat this minute. Because, Elvis, churches considered Elvis that time of year as the Antichrist. They were burning his records. They wouldn't show him from the waist down on television. And people were scandalized by Elvis. But I did an Elvis impersonation. I might have been the very first Elvis impersonator. I just didn't see the possibilities in that as a career. But anyway, I thank Miss Jenkins for that because she held out. It's because of her. She's one of those mirrors that the reason I'm up here today. The last thing I want to tell you is the final story that sort of wraps up my singing. When I was getting up in the middle of the night and writing those stories and had all that energy, I noticed something about my stories. I noticed I was not in my stories. My mother and father were in my stories. Teachers might be in my stories, my grandparents, but I was not an actor in my own story. To be an actor in your own story, you have to have that voice. You have to have agency. And I hadn't had it. And I thought, well, why am I not an actor in my own stories? And that's when I saw her. I saw that 10-year-old child, Dottie Jean, on the stage of Wiley School Auditorium, seeing her in my mind, of course. I saw her there. She was still standing there where I had left her because I was so ashamed of her. And I had left her there, and she was still mouthing the words. And I thought, okay, I'm not going to leave her there again. I'm going to go back for her. So I went back to Dottie Jean, went up to that stage. I went up to her, and I put my ear to her mouth. She was still, I said, sing out, Dottie Jean. We're a soprano. Thank you. Thank you.